So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. We're going to get started. Um, I want to start off by saying that today's talk benefits Green Shakti. And I don't know if everyone on this webinar knows what Green Shakti is, but Green Shakti is based in rural South India. It was founded by Sri Shakti Amma Narayani. It's a nonprofit environmental program that grows and plants trees, over 1.8 million to date, manages 2 tons of waste each day with its zero waste management program, and educates local school kids in all things about Mother Earth. Green Shakti is a collective committed to deepening the relationship between people and nature. So these talks are by donation, and they directly benefit the Green Shakti workers. As many of you know, due to COVID-19, there is massive job loss. So each Green Shakti worker is really the only one in their family employed. And we'll make sure to include the Green Shakti website in the chat box, as well as the link to donations if you feel inclined. So that being said, it is my great pleasure to introduce Daksha Rajagopalan. So Daksha is many amazing things I have discovered. She's a world meditation teacher, a sacred sexuality and wellness coach, a Yale graduate, physicist, anthropologist with 2 master's degrees on honeybees and agriculture. She also has certificates in many other methodologies, among them crystal healing, aura soma practitioner, advanced meditation, restorative yoga. She has done research on biodynamics, spiritual aspects to beekeeping, spent some time practicing and learning in a European shamanic tradition revolving around honeybees, worked alongside natural beekeepers and people who are interested in hearing, learning, listening to the perspective of the honeybee. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. I'm really excited to learn how to listen to the bee, how they communicate, and what do bees have to teach us about collaboration, society, community. So Daksha, with that introduction, welcome.
Thank you, Sonia. Wow, I didn't even know you were talking about me with that introduction. That sounds quite fancy. Thank you.
Well, thank you for being so multifaceted. So as we start, Daksha, and because we introduced Green Shakti, I think we would love to hear a little bit about your relationship to Green Shakti and what it means to you. And it would be wonderful to hear a little bit about the most recent fundraiser that really led us to this topic of honeybees.
Yeah, absolutely. How exciting. So my relationship with Green Shakti, I guess started when I heard that Natalie was doing something called Green Shakti, or was helping Narayani Amma do something called Green Shakti. And I was like, oh my gosh, what is that? It was my mom who introduced me to Narayani Pidam. And so we started like visiting the area when I was 7. And I don't have too many memories then of the landscape, but I know that like when I'm there in Sripuram looking out at the land now, like it's all forested and it's all green. And I know that it wasn't that way a while ago. And to see that change happening like on a large landscape scale, particularly within the larger environmental dialogue of, say, Masanobu Fukuoka, one of the founders of natural farming, he has this beautiful book called Sowing Seeds in the Desert, in addition to his very well-known book, The One Straw Revolution. And in that book, he's talking about the desertification of India and how like so much that has been forested in past centuries, millennia, is now all turning to desert and is continuing on that trajectory. So to really see the land be like back forested and revived in this way in what looks like the span of my life or less than the span of my life, which isn't very long at all, is really magical. It's really magical. What I love about Green Shakti is, well, many things. First off, like the zero waste ex-Nora waste management program, that's so beautiful. Yeah, having visited there and been shown around by Natalie and others, like it's so beautiful, and the way that ties into livelihoods and bringing in the education aspect, because in a lot of parts of the world where survival is a big issue, like caring for the environment,
No,
like that seems so separate, that seems so secondary. And yet, as a whole multifaceted human being, which is a message the bees teach us, as a whole multifaceted human being, there is no survival without your environment. Like those are very much in synergy. So the education aspect that's happening, and the Green Shakti and the schools programs and teaching children those kinds of things is also really beautiful. And the way that the zero waste management program fits into like making it a livelihood thing.
so Daksha, how did we get to honeybees? Now, there have been a number of really interesting fundraisers for Green Shakti for planting trees, but you took a different approach, which has led us here. So why don't you touch upon that?
Sure. Well, I guess in part I have spent a couple years researching honeybees and love honeybees, and my middle name Madhu means honey. Um, and the way this particular fundraiser happened was that Natalie wrote me an email saying, "Would you like to do a fundraiser for your birthday?" And and then I think she sent me a second email saying, "How about honeybees?" And I was like, "Yes, I'm in." And then I like looked it up a little bit, and she mentioned that these medicinal forests, right? These Ayurvedic forests that are being planted. And then there's obviously the more conservation forest around the Sripuram area. And I mean, back to that whole ecosystem approach where like a person doesn't thrive without the environment, like trees and plants, they don't thrive without bees. And so it's like fantastic. And also honeybees, in my experience with the beekeepers and the bees, they carry this frequency of divine mother
Mm.
um, that is so central to the Pidam and Sripuram and Green Shakti and all of that, that I just felt, wow, we need honeybees there.
So honeybees are amazing creatures, and they're in trouble, aren't they? I mean, they're responsible for 80% of all pollination. It's a very high number, I know, and they're involved in producing almost practically every bite of the food we eat. It's something interesting to think about, that what we're ingesting really is thanks to the honey, to the work of the honeybee. But they're dying off at a really high rate at the moment, at least I know in the US, but also in Europe and all over the world. There are issues with pesticides and drought and habitat destruction and nutritional deficit, pollution. I imagine global warming has what to do with it. But they are remarkable, and we can't wait to hear from you all about them. So what would be great, I think, is I'm going to share a few visuals, and maybe you can walk us through.
Sure. Could I
Sound
say
good?
a little thing about what a honeybee is before that?
Yes, please do.
Thanks. So I don't know the exact numbers, but I think there's honeybees and then there's wild bees, and together they're responsible for a huge amount of pollination. But the honeybees are responsible for very specific species. Like without honeybees, we wouldn't have almonds, for
Hmm.
instance. And when we say honeybees, there's actually a few different types of honeybees. Um, there's the European honeybee, which is generally what we think of as the honeybee that lives in a hive. But then there's also these like big Asiatic bees. There's Apis dorsata, there's Apis cerana, and these are these like giant bees that also produce honey and also live in a colony and live in a hive. So with those clarifications, I think the bees we're going to talk about a little bit more today are the European honeybees, just because I know more about them.
Great. So I'm just going to share the screen and you can walk us through.
Sure. And if anyone in the audience has any questions, please feel free to pop them in. And I'll
Yes,
put
that's
them
a
in.
very good point, Daksha. We'll definitely have time for questions. We're going to leave plenty of time for people to ask their burning question about bees. So don't be shy. Please put your questions in the chat box and we'll make sure to get to them.
Fantastic.
So I couldn't help, Daksha, but start with what I find is an absolutely phenomenal photograph of you with a stethoscope. Um, tell us what this is and what exactly are you doing?
So in this picture, I'm on a workshop called Bienen and Spiritualiteit. It was a bees and spirituality workshop at a natural beekeeping center. Yes, I will speak more slowly. Thank you, Margot. So in this picture, I'm at a bees and spirituality workshop in Germany. And what we're doing here is literally listening to the bees, because there is, I mean, it's symbolic as well in a way of like the relationship between the human and the bee and the being of the bee. But more than that, like, how is it that that symbolic relationship actually becomes real? How is it we actually understand and receive information from the bees so we can engage in relationship with them? And that's what's happening here. Like the stethoscope is going there and I'm hearing the buzz in the hive, like it's being amplified. And, you know, you could do this in one hive, you could do this in another hive. You could see how hives have different sounds. In the past, I've taken audio recording devices and stuck them inside different hives or at the entrance of different hives, sometimes like in different swarms, like basically a new colony, a little baby colony. And the tone of voice, the like symphony of buzzes that you hear, they can just be so different from hive to hive. And once I actually recognized a hive just by its sound, I was like, oh yeah, that's that one. And then I checked and it was that one. So what's going on here is a lot of people who have had existing relationships keeping bees, so a lot of beekeepers, were being introduced to embodied and new ways of exploring how do you listen to a bee.
It's wonderful. Okay, so what is the bee, Daksha? What are we looking at here?
So on the left is a picture of a honeybee, and the little yellow circle is pollen that it's carrying in its pollen basket. And on the right is a picture of a whole colony of bees that has started building a hive on a branch of a tree. And when we think of a bee, you know, from our human-centric perspective, we think of it as an insect, you know, with 6 legs. And so we think of it more as the image on the left. And then, you know, a bunch of them live together the way that families of humans live together, and then they look like something on the right. However, there are some biologists who say that when bees come together and function together, they actually behave socially like a mammal. And there's this German word called Biene, which refers to the whole spirit of the hive, the entire being of the entire colony. And so it raises the question, is a bee like really that little thing? Or is it the whole colony? And that's an important question. It's not just a theoretical question, it's an important question, because if the bee is the colony, then how is it we listen to the colony? How is it that like the little pieces of the colony that look different actually communicate? You know, there's all this new research on how trees talk to each other and how under the surface of our planet, all these mycelium, like all these mushrooms are basically like in this giant vast network. And we're actually this interconnected being. It's like the movie Avatar. And it's sort of this whole paradigm shift of, in this case, is the bee this little creature or this big thing? It affects how we do beekeeping. It affects how we actually like take care of bees. And more symbolically, it raises the question for us as humans of, hey, are humans like this or are humans like that? Which
That's
one
an
are you
interesting
really?
question. I mean, it appears to be a very complex and well-organized society. And, you know, I've read in the past that humans can learn a lot about altruism from the bees. What does that mean, Daksha?
So I'm trying to think of where to start this. This is kind of like, let me start with the title of the talk, Honeybees and Gratitude. The reason that the gratitude piece is so important is, and what you're asking, Sonia, about the altruism, is that bees carry that message. They teach that. I know more spiritually oriented beekeepers who would say that they carry the vibration of like the highest kind of love. They carry the vibration of that communal aspect where we're not so clung on to our ego, not so clung on to our identity, not so clung on to our individualism that we can't give ourselves to the whole. In the context of a bee colony, the way that works is when a few bees leave the hive when 1/3 of the bees leave the hive with a new queen to create a swarm and find a new home, they go hang out in a tree or someplace high up, and they send out little scout bees, and they come back and they have like a caucus. They almost have, I've heard it described as a Quaker meeting. And only when all the bees agree do they then go to a new place. And when they're actually in the colony, like the kinds of behaviors that the bees exhibit are very much focused on the collective. They're very much focused on the health of the colony over the health of an individual bee. Like if an individual bee needs to leave the colony or no longer reside in the colony because it's, bringing down the colony, like that's like in bee society, that's okay, because the colony really, that sense of commitment to the health of the whole is what really matters. On the altruism and gratitude piece, Rudolf Steiner, the father of biodynamic things, said that if honeybees die out, humanity won't learn how to love. And I think, there's something about, I think this is there on one of the other slides, but there's something about when we step up to the threshold of a bee colony, like when you're actually walking in to approach the entire being, it's almost like you can feel this zone where you're entering into like a whole nother world. And that whole other world is so full of sensory things. It's so full of honey and sound and smell that it just sort of it's a little bit like sitting in a really profound spiritual ritual of some kind. It sort of transports you to a different zone because it does this beautiful thing with all your senses. And I think that's, please.
No, in one of your blogs, I really enjoyed your quote about anthropologists Kelsey Green and Franklin Ginn following the field work with natural beekeepers in England. And they were inspired by Rudolf Steiner, who you've mentioned, and his spiritual philosophy. And very early on in the 20th century, he wrote extensively on the importance of bees and beekeeping. And a quote that you use that I'd love to read: instead of merely wanting to save the bees, suggests that if we attend to them closely, if we are willing to address and be addressed by the bee, we might get the feeling that the bees have some answers from their own alien realm to give us. And that's kind of ties beautifully to what you're saying, like what an incredible world, a total alien world, but we can learn so much from this world. And it appears to be that now is the time to find ways to listen to the bee.
Yeah, thank you, Sonia, for bringing those threads. I'm reminded of, on that same Bees and Spirituality workshop, I'm reminded of a discussion that we had around death, because bees are dying off. And one of the participants there, because there's colony collapse disorder, they're dying here, there. And one of the participants there shared that if like that person felt that if the bees died off, like they wouldn't die off. They'd just go live in the wild. They'd go live somewhere else. And it wouldn't be like they'd be okay, was this person's thought, but that we'd miss out because they've got this beautiful message for us. And now is that moment for us to listen.
Daksha, tell us, what are we looking at in this slide?
So we're looking here at the autonomy and decision-making power of bees. This is a demonstration. And what is being shown is that the bees, like new bees that were a new swarm that was caught, was brought and placed on the piece of cardboard on the left. And after a few hours, the bees just started walking right into a new hive for them and entered of their own volition into the hive. And so, chose that as their home.
Beautiful.
So
the voice of bees, and we've already mentioned that we're going to talk about ways of listening. Can we listen to bees without our stethoscopes in our pockets? How do we go about this?
Can I share a story, Sonya?
Please.
To that question, the very first time I did anything bee related, I went on a workshop around natural beekeeping, and I was, dipping my toes in the water to see, I feel the call. Is this something I want to dedicate years of my life to researching? And I go on this workshop, and there's the opportunity for some private one-on-one tutorial. So I decided I want to do that. And the person teaching the workshop, I find, also has some experience in shamanism and speaking with spirit and communing with the spirit of the beehive. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. And so this person says to me, would you like to go on a journey to meet the spirit of the bee? And I'm like, of course. So he takes me on this spiritual meditative journey. And we get there. And then after a while, he says to me, this is really interesting. He says, I've never seen this before. But he looks at me and he says, Daksha, you're full of all this light. It's like crystal light. You're full of all this crystal light, but it's solid. It's like solid crystal light. It's almost like a cave so full of crystals that you're almost trapped in the solidity of it. And he said, and the spirit of the bee, like, you're not ready to meet it. So no. And I was like, okay, I'm glad I found out. I'm glad I went on this journey. And I was given the information of, okay, something needs to melt here. Something needs to soften. And so that was the very beginning of my experience working with bees. And over the couple of years, what I noticed in my own personal life was that my sense of this is me, like that sort of like American, that sort of like worldwide now individualism that we're often instilled into culturally, like that started to melt. And I started to be so much more open to community and those kinds of things. So that is one way of, I think, listening to bees without stethoscopes. What's going on in this picture here? So what I have in my hand is a little piece of beeswax that was created in a hive by the bees. And it's a little beginning of what would have been a queen cell. And so they would have laid a queen egg in it. In this case, I believe there actually was a queen egg, and the practice that the beekeepers I was helping were doing was taking away the extra queens so that they would know which one we kind of wanted them to grow for ease of access so that it doesn't grow in some weird place in the hive, I guess. And so it was my first time. Inside of this was an actual little queen egg. And a queen egg is the same as a normal egg. It's just how it's fed, royal jelly. But I was like, ooh, and so I kept this piece. And so yesterday I heard a recording of the sounds that a queen bee makes when she's being birthed and when she is breaking out of this. She makes this very high-pitched tooting noise. And one thing I haven't mentioned is that the queen bees, like, they emanate these pheromones, and I don't think we fully understand them, but they emanate these pheromones that keep the hive together and that communicate across the hive. And I think that's part of that frequency of love that one can feel when you approach a beehive.
That is so beautiful.
So a while ago, some really beautiful and wise people whose names escape me right this second, thought this, like the queen bee grows into something magnificent when she's in here. What is it that happens when she's in here? What is it like to be in this little thing and to grow in that? And they thought, what would it be like for a human to experience what it's like to be inside a queen bee cell? And so they built this, and this is magic. It is in Germany at this beautiful place called Mellifera.
Mm.
And it's a lot of beeswax, It's quite thick. I think beeswax of that quality and of that quantity would be worth close to its weight in gold in terms of value financially. And it's in a multi like sided, I think octagonal or 6-sided, I don't remember, but it's basically in a temple sort of building. And you walk in and there's the opportunity to go. So the orange bits that you see at the bottom of this giant beeswax ball, for a sense of scale, the piece of paper on the bottom right that's laminated is like a normal size piece of paper.
Right.
So like the orange bits, they aren't on the floor. They're like on a pedestal and on a platform, and you can go in, climb up a little ladder, and basically there's a meditation cushion where you can sit almost like at the base where the orange things are, and you can put your whole upper body into this thing that's completely dark on the inside because the wax wall is like that, and it's so full of all the smells of the wax, and then you can, you know, sing in it and hear the echoes, and it's a place that transports you, that transports me into magical bee smells and that whole feeling with the darkness and this and that.
So Daksha, is this part of the shamanistic experience that you alluded to?
No, that's different.
Okay.
I think this is, well, in my experience, all these things are like more than just being human experiences. They're all somewhat spiritual in a way. So it was somewhat spiritual in a way, but this was different from the shamanic experiences I was alluding to. That's a different body, a different group of people and teachers and this and that. But I think that this, the reason this comes with this title is that zone of listening that one gets transported to in encountering spiritual experiences, in encountering meditation, in encountering prayer, in encountering contemplation or mindfulness. That zone of listening is the same zone of listening I've heard many beekeepers say that they get messages from the bees.
I see.
That could be practical things like they are sitting in front of their hive and they notice things because they're in that zone. That could be they're lying down on the couch after going and working with their bees, and then they get intuitions or they have dreams of this is what needs to be done. But that zone, it's almost like part of what the bees have to teach us in this now moment requires that we step up to being able to hear them. And that process of just stepping up to be able to hear them is a process of spiritual growth for us.
Beautiful. Yeah, let's talk about the hive system and some practices. What are we looking at here, Daksha?
We're looking on the right at a kind of hive called the warrior hive. It's a beehive system that's traditionally a bit more bee friendly. You know, bees are able to build their comb downwards and such like that. What we're looking at on the left, that picture is an image of a hive tool. It's something that almost every beekeeper carries. It's like, it lets you, you know, the sharp edge on the top, it lets you like dig into the bits of wood and separate them. The little red thing that hangs, you can hang it on the hive. Like it's a most versatile tool that, every beekeeper I know has.
Right.
Except for one beekeeper. And that's what's going on in this picture. I went to visit these hives with this beekeeper, and this wonderful beekeeper had built this warrior hive system with like little plexiglass peepholes that were and this beekeeper had a way of lifting the hive and weighing it so that they could ascertain how many bees there were in there and how heavy the hive was and where the honey was coming down to, where the comb was coming down to with the peepholes. And I remember we were going there, and I said, at some point I was like, oh, you don't have a hive tool. And this person just threw up their arms. They said, why would I need a hive tool? And for me, that was a giant aha moment, because I just took for granted that every beekeeper needed a hive tool. And this one person was like, why would I need it? Because I have extensive logs. I come here, I observe, I watch, and I have little peepholes. So I'm very attuned to where my hives are, what they need. So why would I ever need to open? And the reason this came up is because this person likened opening a hive back to the very first image of, is a bee a little insect or is it a giant being?
Right.
This person likened opening a hive to doing surgery. Because when you open a hive, all the pheromones, the heat, the different things that are very much part of the internal atmosphere of a colony escape.
I love how you talk about all these spiritual aspects of beekeeping. It's very thought-provoking, because a lot of these beekeepers sounds like not only do they have to have astute observation, but a type of oneness. You have to be one with the bees, with the hive, and you have to have profound instincts about this world.
And I think those are things that develop over time,
I loved this quote very much. Do you want to give it a read, Daksha?
Sure. Thank you, by the way, so Mark Winston, who I ended up meeting at a conference a couple of years ago and got to talk to, has this lovely book, Bee Time. And in the very beginning of the book, he says, it's a full body experience being among the bees. First, you hear the sound, the low hum of tens of thousands of female workers flying in and out of their hives, each circling the apiary to get her bearings, and then heading off purposefully in a literal beeline toward blooming flowers. Smells and textures bombard the senses next. The sweet odors of beeswax and honey, the stickiness of plant resins collected by the workers to plug holes and construct the base of their combs. And then there are the bees themselves, walking over your hands and forearms as you lift and return combs from the hive, the subtlest of touches as their claws lightly cling and release.
It's a beautiful, poetic choreography. It's a real dance. What do we have here, Daksha?
Thanks, Sonya. That is what is known as a sun hive. There's two things happening in this picture. One of them is it's a very hot day, so some of the bees are coming out to air on the outside and cool off. That's why there's some outside. But the other thing that's happening in this picture is this hive itself. So it was innovated by someone who was, the story goes, he was walking around in the forest and he saw some bees. And he realized that the way that bees, honeybees, European honeybees, naturally build a hive in the Northern Hemisphere, I think this was in Germany or Austria, his name eludes me, if I look it up, I'll tell you, is that they naturally build a hive like almost in an egg shape, like the shape that gets formed when you take a rope and let it sag in gravity, like that's the shape. It's not a parabola, it's not a square, it's this. And he thought, if bees build a hive in this shape naturally, then, what happens if we want to be able to keep a hive of some kind that, is openable so that, we can maybe take out some honey and manage the bees rather than letting them be completely wild? Can we build a hive that honors that? So this hive, known in English as the sun hive, is really interesting. So it's built to these extremely specific proportions. And if you get a tiny bit off, it doesn't work. And what it does when it works, I mean, it works, it's a hive, but what really happens when it works is that, oh, I wish I had a cross section here to show you. Okay, here's a little piece of comb. So the bees, they build a comb, and then they build another one, they build another one. And this is that shape in the beginning, kind of. And they get out. And this hive on the outside has basically like an outer wall. Thank you, yeah, catenary curve. On the outer wall, like it's made with it's like a human-made material rather than beeswax and propolis. It's still natural, but you can see the basket weaving and stuff. So the outer wall kind of like screws on. And so the bees, they start building. And because they're building in this shape, when they get to this outer wall, their backs brush against the outer wall. They bump against the outer wall and they stop building, which is magical. Because otherwise, if you've ever seen a beehive somewhere in the wild or just seen them do something, these bits of wax, they get attached they attach them to the wall. And when the wax is attached to the wall, you can't open the hive without cutting the wax, without basically breaking the hive. And so what's really interesting with this is in this shape, you can let them build the way they'd build, and the attachment doesn't happen if the shape is just right. And then you can screw it up and remove it and put it back, and maybe break off a little piece of comb and put it back. So that's what this hive is. It's a sun hive.
Wow. Highly intelligent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that there. Shall I go on, Sonia? Did you have a specific question?
Please do.
So there's a tradition of tree beekeeping. I mean, yeah, bees build hives in trees, but there's traditions around these, right? Because humans have been gathering honey for years, and there's different traditions in different parts of the world. So this is a Russian tradition of tree beekeeping, which I think some Polish beekeepers have been still practicing and are reviving. So there's this whole new branch of this whole old branch of this new revival of this Polish tree beekeeping. And this is a tree in which some Polish beekeepers had come and, taught the people I was working with how to build these hives. And so I think they've done a workshop around that. And what's going on is just like a little, like in the beginning, as the hive is getting established, they put up a little platform. And so, you can climb up on the platform. I went up on the platform and, you can check on the hive, make sure things are going well. And if we zoom, I can't zoom in the picture, but like right in the center, you see that little like, yeah, thank you. That whole thing of green stuff. That's basically like a bunch of leaves with some twigs that have been woven together or threaded together with bits of string. I think I can almost see 2 bits of string. Maybe I'm making it up, but and that's basically the door to the hive. Like they took some chainsaws, they cut a hole, they dug out some space, and then like that's the door. So that's what we're looking at here, a different way of beekeeping. And I've heard it said that bees, a colony of bees, it likes to be left alone. It doesn't like any other bees in its area, really. And a bee, like when I say a bee, I mean that for that second image of the whole colony is a bee. Like a bee extends sometimes to 2-3 miles wide as a superorganism when it's foraging. And so here there's a bee in a tree and it's got its domain, and not many other bee colonies around.
And can we see this kind of tree beehive approach all over the world, or is this more relegated to Eastern Europe and Russia?
Well, I mean, there's definitely like the honey foragers, that we see across South Asia in the forests. I don't know the answer to that from the context of if the beehives are like managed in the trees, or if it's more of going there and collecting it, because that's generally classed as honey hunting rather than beekeeping. But yeah, bees and trees. I believe it takes place in many parts of the world. And some of the other bees, like Apis cerana, Apis dorsata, like they live on the branches of trees You know, we see them particularly, I think, in North India and stuff, or in the mountainous regions. Like they form this like big basically one giant comb hanging off a tree.
Beautiful. What are we looking at here, Daksha?
You know, just on this train of thought, if there are a whole variety, there is a richness of systems to beekeeping.
Yeah.
It's not like the one box that we see in the West and in the East now in most places.
It's such a good point. And I love what this presentation really gives us a sense of this variety, and it's extraordinary. It's unexpected to see so many different applications.
So this hive in particular is from a rural part of Germany. It's a traditional hive they've had. And I think the way that this one works, where is it from? Schwabia in Germany. And the way it works is you let the bees, how does this work? So that's the entrance. And at some point you basically turn the hive around. So sometimes when you want to take honey from a hive, like the way you manage it is you let the bees build in like the upper or lower fraction. You let the bees breed in the upper lower fraction, and you take honey from the other one. Like in the wild, it would be like in the wild in the Warre hive where the guy was with the hive tool saying, "I don't need a hive tool." That slide, the honey would be taken from the bottom. In the traditional beehives that we see everywhere, like those white boxes or those painted colorful boxes that stack up, most of the time the hives are in the honey is in what's called supers, which is in the top of the hive, because that's easier for a beekeeper to take. Right. However, there's some reasons why that actually isn't optimal for the honeybee. Because one of the largest pests for honeybees is Varroa destructor. It weakens their immune system, and wipes out, like if they get that mite in, then they start getting like this deformed wing virus and other things. Not good for a bee colony. And like a Varroa mite, just for scale, if you were a little bee, then the Varroa mite would be like the size of a rabbit for you. But the thing is, these Varroa mites, they don't survive in like hot, humid places. Above a certain temperature, they can't breed. And when like just pure thermodynamics of a beehive, like hot air rises. So when the hive is a certain shape and the brood where the baby bees are laid, which is where the Varroa mite goes and tries to live or make its killing, if it's at the top of the hive, then sometimes it can actually be hot enough that the Varroa mite can't live there. So when we start moving the breeding area down below, because it's easier for humans to then take honey from the top, we're changing a lot of things. And, there isn't a right and a wrong. Right. There isn't like a black and white, good and bad. It's all on a scale. Like everything's in a scale of like how bee friendly, how human friendly. And it's a matter of like, where is the balance right now and what is helpful for the system.
So I see there are quite a few questions in the chat box, and perhaps now is a good time to address some of them. I really am curious what you think about Lynn's question about why do bees sting humans? What is the message in the sting? And I know that we touched a little bit upon shamanism and bee shamanism and ancient bee therapies. And I recall that bee stings were used traditionally on certain meridians and were used for healing. But maybe you can take a crack at Lynn's question, Daksha.
Sure, sure. So there's a few different kinds of stings. There's stings that are like back off stings. There are stings that are you're not listening stings. There are stings that are you've just poured a whole bunch of smoke in my hive and I think the place is on fire. And maybe I haven't gorged up on enough honey because I'm in survival mode. And so I'm not yet pacified and lethargic because of the honey, but I'm scared, so let me sting you. So there are different kinds of stings. There are stings, one of the most painful stings I received was a sting on the scalp, because there's stings of, this was a really cool moment for me. There's stings of, I'm in your hair. It looks like a spider web. How do I survive? I'm caught in a spider web. Let me sting. And then there's a whole nother category of stings, some of which I've had. So yes, apitherapy is certainly an ancient tradition that's still practiced. Like I know people who still work with bees on meridian points. If I'm not mistaken, I haven't validated this, but if I'm not mistaken, like acupuncture may or may not have developed from using bee stings and bee venom in different places. I've heard some stories from beekeepers, from a beekeeper in particular, about how a bee, I've heard a few stories about how like bees would sting that person on the exact same point every single time. And it wouldn't surprise me, right? Given what we've been discussing about this frequency of love, and how like attuned and sensitive they are teaching us to be, should we take that invitation and listen, that they might be able to sense imbalances and then go there. Because those same people, myself included, who've been stung over and over in like the exact same spot, like those aren't obvious spots. Like there's times I've had bees, and other people I know have had bees like up a jeans leg or up somewhere else where like, you know, kind of trapped, you might sting, but they don't sting sometimes in those places, but they will instead go to an exact other point and go over and over until something gets balanced there.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. So
I've also, one other thing, Sonia, sorry, I've also heard non-beekeeper, more like spiritually oriented people who don't keep bees, but who respect them, speak about initiations with stings. And I don't know about this, but I wouldn't be surprised if, given that I know there are like bee shamanic lineages, one of which I have learned a little bit in and trained in, I wouldn't be surprised if there certainly were like initiations that the bees did, or, you know, perhaps traditionally in some places in the world, they were invited into.
So Margot would love to know, she's based in France, and there are a lot of different kinds of honey and propolis. So what is the landscape in India? What are the different kinds of honey and propolis there?
I'm not an expert on the landscape of bees in India, but the different kinds of honey that are there have to do with where the bees are getting their nectar flow from. And given that it is a tropical region with a lot of nectar flow, there would be a lot of different kinds of honey. And propolis comes from tree sap. So again, different kinds. I know there are some, a master healer that I know in India once said that there's a certain kind of bee. I don't know if it's a European honeybee, but there is a certain kind of bee that I believe creates a certain kind of honey, that and they live inside ant hills or termite hills. I know my mom's on here and I think she might remember this story a little bit better. But they create honey inside certain termite hills or ant hills. And this happens in India. And that honey is supposed to be extremely rare and like highly medicinal for some rare conditions or terminal conditions.
So Kathy's curious because she's read quite a bit about African killer bees. Now in the US, there have been articles proliferating about the danger. Is Is it real? Is it a real threat? Is it a threat to the indigenous bee colonies?
I'm going to say again, I don't know the answer to that.
Mm.
I am skeptical. As someone who's had a social science and anthropology background, and one of my master's research was on beekeeping in Malta, and a lot of what I went into there and experienced there were a lot of like politics between beekeepers on the different races of their bees, and how certain bees, how certain beehives, sorry, I got distracted, how certain bee subspecies were threatening like the purity of their own indigenous native bee. Like that is a real threat, that can be a real threat, but also like there's a lot of extra hype in many of these things where subconscious collective race biases come in. For example, when the Africanized killer bee came out, like, you know, in the very first time we heard of it, like that sort of came out and became, you know, this thing where like a lot of racial discourses were brought into it in the way that we came to fear the African killer bee. And similarly, like, as far as I'm aware, there isn't such a thing as indigenous honeybee colony in the US. These are European honeybees. They came over from somewhere else at some point. So, but that doesn't answer the question at all of like, how is this affecting our current bees that are living here and providing these pollination services? I don't know the answer to that. However, from that sort of social science perspective, like I would advise caution when we think about things that have racial implications, and the sense of what is here right now has been here forever, and that's indigenous, when there sometimes are other things that are far more indigenous to a place.
That's a helpful way to frame it. We have an interesting question from Selden about the total mass of bees. Do you want to give this one a go?
Oh, yikes. Is there someone else here better with back of the envelope calculations than I am? Probably is.
Yeah, this is it's an interesting question, but I think in terms of bee populations, and we do know that we are faced with a crisis, and I've even read that, you know, different countries are investigating ways to create robotic pollinators because the bees are dying. You know, what's your view on this, Daksha?
So Sonya, you'll have to ask me the question again because I got off on a tangent where someone was doing research on how bees are being used by defense departments because they have a super high sense of smell. So they're being used and trained to like track out smell and things like that, like drug detection and stuff.
Wow.
But what was the question?
Just, you know, going back to Selden, we may not have the exact answer about the mass, but in terms of dying bee populations and the crisis that we're facing in terms of that, you know, there are countries I've read that are investigating, you know, replacements like robotic, you know, bee pollinators and human pollinators and all sorts of technology around this to try to alleviate some of this destruction. So I'm just wondering what your view on that is. And it seems like that's a big area of research.
Yeah. If I'm to be honest, I haven't thought about that question in a while because it's quite a depressing question to think about.
Yeah.
But if I were to return to the last time I seriously gave that question some consideration, you know, I think we have like the equilibrium of bee colonies is so out of balance because of all these little factors, and some of them are big factors, but there's so many things at play in that. Like even with colony collapse disorder, for instance, we don't know why it happens. And what happens there is basically most of the bees leave except for like the queen and a few bees. And then like, where do the bees go? We don't know. We have a whole bunch of theories. Some people say it's 5G, some people say it's pesticides, some people say it's climate change, some people say it's this. We have no idea at the end of the day. Well, maybe we have ideas. We have no consensus at the end of the day. And without consensus, you know, in the way that a bee colony decides where it's going to go, like I mentioned earlier, it's like a Quaker meeting. They get consensus and they decide where they want to go. When we don't have consensus as humans, and we have like multiple different truths on the table, and we're so attached to these truths because we really want to help, and we think our truth is the way we're going to help, then we end up engaging in war and battle between this truth and that truth and this truth and that truth, and we don't get to consensus, and then we can't really do anything to help bees.
It's a lesson we need to learn from the bees for sure.
Yeah, and without learning that lesson, and here's the thing, without learning that lesson, I'm not really sure we can do anything besides what that one beekeeper said. You know, if the bees go off and die, disappear from like cultural zones, you know, they might be fine somewhere, who knows, fingers crossed. I'd like to think that, but we're going to miss out on a lot. And so will our ecosystems. So will society. But one thing I'm hopeful about is right now, with what's happening on the planet and the amount of large-scale structural change that is possible, perhaps however we learn and grow might allow for that consensus to come around so that we can care for bees better.
That's really well expressed. Daksha, we have a question from Sarah about Manuka honey. We hear a lot about Manuka honey. You know, can you tell us a little bit about why it's so healing compared to other honeys?
I could try. I'll tell you why I'm laughing shortly thereafter. Actually, I probably couldn't tell you why. But what I can tell you is that the amount of Manuka honey that is sold in the United Kingdom alone every year is more than the amount of Manuka honey that is made in New Zealand every year. So,
oh dear, we have a situation.
Yeah, which is why I left. So yeah. I personally have not experienced wonderful benefits from Manuka honey, but that also might be because I never really had real Manuka honey. It's hard to tell what's real and what's not. In terms of why it's so healing, I'm sorry, Sarah, I'm not the person for that. I don't know the answer.
Well, you've certainly alerted us that there's more being produced than possible, so we'll keep that in mind.
And another thing, just on that note, a lot of people don't know this. A lot of things that go as honey on the market aren't honey or are produced from some aspect of sugar water and not from a plant nectar flow. I mean, yes, beekeepers feed honey sugar at some point, but sometimes it's produced almost primarily from sugar water or from like juice concentrate and not actually from nectar flow. So those are things to keep in mind when you think about where you're sourcing honey in terms of its medicinal, healing, or even tastiness value for yourself and your family.
So Daksha, we've touched upon kind of the beginning of so many interesting topics, you know, bee shamanism, the frequency of love, you know, bee stings and their messages, you know, the spiritual experience of beekeeping, nectar flow. And I just want to end with what we started with, which is bees and gratitude. So we know, and science really knows, that gratitude is proven to bring happiness. And it's really one of the most overlooked tools for happiness. It brings so much positivity. So maybe as we end this talk today, you can tell us a little bit more about your views on bees and gratitude, its benefits, and what we could learn.
I think that's such a timely question, given that some people are celebrating American Thanksgiving soon. and certainly the internet is celebrating Black Friday soon. Um, what we can learn in terms of gratitude. Um, you know, I'm going to bring this back as well, Sonia, to the very first question you asked me about my relationship with Green Sakthi. One thing that I love about Green Sakthi, and for those of you who joined us later, all these Green Sakthi talks are by donation, and the proceeds go to supporting workers who help plant trees and are the sole, at this point, the sole breadwinners for their family during COVID. So one thing that I really love about Green Sakthi and just about the way that things operate is once, I had a conversation, I think, with Natalie around who organizes in Green Sakthi around, how to fundraise for something or the other. And, I have a little bit of a academic background and a little bit of a marketing background. So I was thinking, how do you, convince people? How do you get them to take action? I was thinking of these things. And she was like, no, you're thinking about this all wrong. Like, people give. And I think she said that Shakti Amma said, people give when their heart is full of love. People give when there's something in their heart that makes them want to give. And I think that quality, that comes from gratitude. And I think that's what's really beautiful about both Green Sakthi and also about like what the bees have to teach us at this juncture in civilization. Like that sense of, back to the story, if I went and this bee shaman took me on a journey and said, you're too crystalline, you're too rigid, Daksha, you can't hang out with the bees right now. And then I went on this journey to kind of melt some of that. That whole melting some of that, right, brought me to this place of being more community focused, more like, yikes, I'm not going to lose myself if I love other people and let them in deeply. And I think that's part of that gratitude piece, right? Because when it is that we come from what's really in the heart, then we're able to be part of community, then we're able to come to consensus, then we're able to work together. And then we're able to help the bees so that they don't have to, no longer exist on planet Earth. And in that, we have the opportunity to bring that frequency of gratitude. And, if that's a bit woo-woo, like, practically like practice more gratitude in society, in the sense of, how can we rebuild? How can we recreate what humanity is like going forward from these times?
Thank you, Daksha. Thank you, everyone. This has been a really illuminating talk. Here's to being less rigid and melting the crystalline and reaching consensus. All of the websites are in the chat box, the Green Sakthi website, Daksha's website. And you can find Daksha on all social media. There's so much to learn. We've only scratched the surface, but I know that I am filled with gratitude. So thank you, Daksha. And thank you, everyone. And thank you, Green Sakthi.
Thank you all so much.
Have a beautiful day, everyone. Have a beautiful weekend, and we'll see you soon.